Racial profiling has been one of the most persistent and damaging issues in law enforcement, a reflection of prejudice that runs deeper than just the color of someone's skin. In this story, the moment the officer saw the black man step out of his luxury car, his assumptions began to build a narrative in his mind, a narrative not based on facts, but on stereotypes and bias. The officer didn't see a professional, a leader, or a citizen deserving of respect. He saw what his prejudice wanted him to see: someone suspicious, someone out of place. Without a single question or investigation, he decided that the man didn't belong in that neighborhood, behind that car, or dressed in that manner. That single moment of judgment set off a chain of events that would soon expose the dangerous consequences of racial profiling. The officer's attitude was sharp and commanding. His tone was not that of protection or service, but of superiority and intimidation. As he approached, he didn't introduce himself politely or ask if the man needed assistance. Instead, he barked orders, his hand resting on his holster as if he were already preparing for a confrontation. The black man, calm but clearly confused, tried to ask what the problem was. But the officer wasn't listening. He was convinced he already knew the story. In his eyes, the man was a threat simply because he was black and confident. The officer's actions were not about maintaining order, they were about asserting dominance over someone he believed he could control. This moment revealed the silent psychology behind racial profiling, the unspoken belief that certain people must constantly prove their innocence while others are assumed to be innocent by default. The officer wasn't enforcing the law, he was enforcing a stereotype. Every movement the man made was viewed with suspicion. When he reached for his wallet, the officer's hand went to his gun. When he tried to speak calmly, the officer interpreted it as defiance. Every attempt at explanation was twisted into a form of resistance. It was as if the officer had already written the man's guilt before the first word was spoken. Spectators began to notice the tension. Some pulled out their phones, unsure of what would happen next. The man stood still, careful not to make any sudden moves, knowing how easily these encounters could spiral into tragedy. But what made this situation different was the man's composure. He wasn't just calm, he was deliberate. He knew who he was, and he knew that eventually, the truth would reveal itself. But in that moment, he also understood the heartbreaking reality of being judged not by actions, but by appearance. The officer's assumptions were a mirror of a much larger issue, the systemic conditioning that teaches people to fear what they don't understand and to assert control over those they underestimate. As the officer continued questioning him, his tone grew harsher. He accused the man of stealing the car, of being in a restricted area, of resisting commands, anything to justify the arrest he had already made up his mind about. The man's attempts to explain were drowned out by the officer's aggression. The power imbalance was clear. One wore a badge and carried authority, the other carried centuries of history that made every encounter like this one a potential headline. The irony was that the very system designed to protect was now the one threatening his safety. Every second of that confrontation was a reminder of how dangerous assumptions can be. The officer's belief in his own authority blinded him to logic. He didn't check identification before handcuffing the man. He didn't call for backup to verify information. Instead, he relied solely on his perception, a perception rooted in bias, not truth. To him, the color of the man's skin was enough evidence. This was not law enforcement, it was prejudice wearing a uniform. The air around them felt heavy, filled with tension and disbelief. The bystanders whispered, some in outrage, others in fear. They had seen stories like this before, on television, on social media, in protests, but seeing it unfold before their eyes was different. The man's calmness only intensified the discomfort of everyone watching. It was as if his silence spoke louder than any protest could. He wasn't fighting the officer physically, but his refusal to react with anger or aggression was itself a powerful act of defiance. It exposed the absurdity of the situation. One man was losing control, while the other, despite being humiliated, remained in control of himself. Racial profiling doesn't just humiliate its victims, it reveals the insecurities of those who engage in it. The officer's need to assert control came from fear, fear of being wrong, fear of being challenged, fear of facing someone who didn't fit his narrow view of who should hold power. The man's very existence in that space, dressed in success, carrying confidence, was enough to threaten the fragile foundation of the officer's prejudice. What made the situation tragic wasn't just the injustice, but the fact that it was entirely avoidable. If the officer had paused for one moment to look beyond the surface, he would have seen not a suspect, but a human being. Abuse of authority often begins with a single moment, the moment when power stops being about responsibility and starts becoming a tool for ego. In this situation, the officer's authority was supposed to represent justice, order, and protection, but instead, it became a weapon of humiliation. From the instant he decided to confront the man, his actions weren't driven by duty, they were driven by pride and prejudice. Authority, when misused, transforms from a symbol of respect into a shield for wrongdoing. That's exactly what unfolded when the officer chose to assert control not because of any crime, but because he could. It wasn't about keeping the peace, it was about proving he held power over someone else. As the black man tried to explain himself, the officer's tone grew louder, his commands more aggressive. He interrupted every sentence, talked over every attempt at reason, and made sure his presence dominated the moment. He wasn't interested in dialogue or facts. What he wanted was submission. The man's calm demeanor only made him angrier. In the officer's mind, authority wasn't something to be exercised with fairness, it was something to be obeyed without question. Every movement he made, the way he stood too close, the way he spoke with arrogance, the way he threatened arrest for simple questions, was an exhibition of control. He wanted to remind the man, and everyone watching, that his badge gave him the right to do whatever he pleased. Abuse of authority doesn't always come from shouting or violence, sometimes, it comes from subtle humiliation. The officer ordered the man to step aside, demanded identification, and spoke as if addressing a criminal. He ignored the discomfort in the man's eyes, ignored the crowd's growing unease, and ignored the moral responsibility that came with his position. In that moment, he wasn't protecting anyone, he was performing for himself. Every gesture, every unnecessary command, every raised voice was part of a performance meant to reinforce superiority. It was the kind of behavior that turns law enforcement into intimidation rather than safety. The most striking part was how quickly the officer escalated the situation without justification. When the man hesitated to answer a question, not out of defiance, but confusion, the officer accused him of resisting. When he reached for his wallet, the officer warned him to keep his hands visible, as though expecting a threat. The power imbalance became suffocating. The man had done nothing wrong, yet he was treated like a suspect simply because the officer's authority allowed it. The badge, which should have symbolized accountability, became untouchable armor. It gave the officer confidence that whatever he said would be believed, and whatever the man said would be doubted. That blind confidence is what makes abuse of authority so dangerous, it silences truth before truth can even be spoken. As bystanders watched, some began recording on their phones. The officer noticed but didn't stop. He wanted to appear in control. His posture stiffened, his voice grew harsher, and his pride swelled with every second of attention. The uniform had given him an audience, and he used it to assert his dominance. What he failed to realize was that his behavior was not strength, it was insecurity disguised as power. He wasn't protecting the law, he was hiding behind it. This is how authority becomes abuse, when the person holding it forgets that it comes with accountability, not immunity. The man's restraint during the entire ordeal was almost unsettling in its calmness. Despite the insults, the threats, and the unnecessary aggression, he refused to react with anger. It wasn't submission, it was discipline. He understood that one wrong move could justify the officer's narrative. That's the cruel irony of abusive authority, it forces its victims to stay calm even when they're being mistreated, because reacting to injustice can be twisted into guilt. The officer thrived on that imbalance. Every order he gave was designed to provoke, to push boundaries, to remind the man who was in charge. But the man's silence spoke volumes. It showed that power doesn't always lie in who's shouting the loudest, sometimes, it lies in who refuses to be broken. The crowd's whispers grew louder. Some people were outraged, others afraid, but no one dared intervene. The authority of the uniform kept everyone at a distance. It was as if the badge itself carried an invisible barrier that discouraged anyone from challenging him. That's the quiet terror of power abuse, it isolates its victims and silences witnesses. The officer stood there, convinced that his position would protect him from any consequence. He acted as if his word was law, not realizing that real authority demands humility, not arrogance. Even when the man finally provided identification, the officer barely looked at it. His mind was already set. He wasn't searching for truth, he was searching for justification. The more composed the man remained, the more agitated the officer became. He mistook calmness for defiance and dignity for disrespect. The power he wielded began to expose his own moral weakness. Authority without ethics becomes nothing more than sanctioned bullying. And in that moment, his every action reflected the very corruption that the badge was supposed to stand against. The turning point came when the officer, fully convinced he had complete control over the situation, demanded identification from the man he had just humiliated. With the same calmness that had defined him throughout the confrontation, the man reached into his jacket pocket and handed over his ID. The officer snatched it without a glance, ready to continue his lecture about respecting the law and knowing your place. But as his eyes flickered down to the name printed on the card, his tone began to shift. The badge of arrogance on his face wavered for a moment, replaced by confusion. He read the name again, slower this time, and his eyes widened as recognition hit him. The man standing in front of him wasn't some random passerby or suspect, he was someone with influence, someone respected, someone the department knew very well. The officer's grip on authority began to loosen the second he realized who he was dealing with. The man he had just handcuffed and spoken down to wasn't just a citizen, he was a high-ranking executive, a board member for one of the city's largest companies, and someone who had personally partnered with the mayor's office on community reform programs, including initiatives for police accountability. In a single instant, the power dynamic shifted completely. The silence that followed felt heavy, as though the weight of the officer's mistake was pressing down on the air around them. The bystanders could sense something had changed, but they didn't yet know what it was. The officer's face, once full of confidence, now carried a shade of panic. His posture straightened, his voice softened, and his tone turned hesitant, almost apologetic. Authority, which moments earlier had been his shield, was now the very thing exposing his wrongdoing. The man stood still, saying nothing. He didn't need to. The officer's reaction spoke louder than any confrontation could. He began fumbling over his words, trying to explain his actions as routine procedure, claiming that he was only doing his job. But everyone watching could see through the performance. His voice trembled slightly, his movements lost their sharpness, and the arrogance that once filled his every command was replaced by unease. It was the moment when realization collided with consequence. The officer had spent years believing that his badge gave him power over others, but now, standing in front of someone far above his understanding, he felt the full sting of what misuse of that power really meant. The man's identity had revealed more than just his name, it exposed the fragile foundation on which the officer's prejudice was built. The same man he had assumed to be dangerous was a figure of authority, someone who employed hundreds of people, someone whose reputation carried more weight than the officer's badge ever could. What made the moment even more powerful was how the man didn't gloat or retaliate. His calmness remained, steady and unshaken. The restraint he had shown earlier now seemed even more significant, because it wasn't just the calmness of an innocent man, it was the composure of someone who understood true power doesn't need to shout. It was the kind of quiet strength that exposes injustice without uttering a single word. The officer's colleagues, who had arrived as backup moments too late, immediately sensed the tension. They looked at the ID, exchanged uneasy glances, and their demeanor changed entirely. The respect that should have been present from the start now flooded the scene, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The crowd, now fully aware that something extraordinary had happened, began whispering in disbelief. Phones that had been recording captured every detail, the officer's initial aggression, the moment of realization, and the visible discomfort that followed. What had started as an abuse of power was now a public unraveling of prejudice in real time. The irony was painful. The officer had spent years patrolling neighborhoods like this one, making assumptions about people based on their looks, their cars, or their clothes. He had been trained to see authority as dominance rather than duty. But now, faced with someone who represented success, leadership, and dignity, his narrow understanding of power was collapsing. The man's calm presence became a mirror reflecting the officer's flaws back at him, his impatience, his arrogance, his racism, and his insecurity. It was no longer just a confrontation between two people, it had become a lesson in accountability that would echo far beyond that street corner. The officer's attempt to regain composure only made things worse. He tried to apologize without fully admitting fault, tried to justify his behavior as a misunderstanding, but his tone betrayed him. His words lacked sincerity because deep down, he knew the truth. He hadn't made a mistake based on incomplete information, he had made a choice based on bias. The man's identity didn't change the fact that he had been profiled, disrespected, and detained without cause. What it did change, however, was the officer's sense of invincibility. For the first time, he realized that his actions had consequences, and those consequences would not be hidden behind the silence of authority. The bystanders who had been hesitant before were now bold. Their voices rose with questions, comments, and outrage. The story was already being shared online, spreading faster than the officer could process. His expression revealed a mix of embarrassment and fear, fear of exposure, fear of accountability, fear of losing everything he had taken for granted. The man remained composed, watching quietly as the officer stumbled through his apology. It wasn't revenge he was after, it was revelation. The truth had surfaced on its own. In that single moment, the power dynamic had flipped entirely, not because the man had demanded respect, but because his truth had forced it. Power of dignity and self-control often reveals itself most clearly when one is tested under humiliation and injustice. In the middle of that heated confrontation, when the officer's voice rose, his commands became cruel, and the weight of prejudice filled the air, the man chose a response that disarmed everyone watching: calm silence. He didn't yell, didn't argue, didn't curse the injustice that was happening before him. He simply stood with quiet strength, his composure becoming more powerful than any resistance could have been. His stillness wasn't weakness, it was mastery. It was the strength of someone who understood that reacting with anger might satisfy the oppressor's ego, but responding with dignity exposes the truth more effectively than words ever could. Each word the officer shouted, each accusation hurled without reason, seemed to bounce off him. The man's calmness wasn't the absence of emotion, it was discipline. Inside, he felt anger, humiliation, and disbelief, but he refused to let those emotions dictate his behavior. He knew that losing control would only feed the narrative that the officer wanted to create. He also knew that self-control in moments of chaos has a power that commands respect even from those who don't deserve it. Every second that passed, his restraint became a silent challenge to the officer's authority. While the officer tried to provoke him, the man's calm demeanor made it clear who truly held the moral power in that situation. People watching could feel it too. There was something about his silence that changed the entire energy of the scene. Instead of shouting or defending himself, he let the officer's words echo into emptiness. The crowd could see the contrast: one man was consumed by ego and aggression, while the other radiated self-respect and patience. Dignity, in that moment, became its own kind of protest. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniably powerful. His calmness spoke of wisdom that came from experience, from years of knowing what it meant to be misjudged and mistreated, yet never letting bitterness define him. Every breath he took was a reminder that true power lies not in how you dominate others, but in how you maintain yourself when others try to tear you down. When the officer handcuffed him, roughly pushing his arms behind his back, the man didn't resist. He looked directly into the officer's eyes, not with fear, but with quiet confidence. That look unsettled the officer more than any protest could. It said everything without needing words, that he would not be broken, that his worth wasn't determined by how others treated him. The man's calm gaze pierced through the arrogance of the uniform, forcing the officer to confront something deeper than authority: shame. The strength it took to stay composed under such blatant disrespect wasn't physical, it was emotional courage, the kind that comes from knowing your truth is stronger than anyone's prejudice. Self-control in such moments isn't about silence for its own sake, it's about choosing peace over chaos. The man understood that the officer's aggression came from insecurity. He knew that every insult was a reflection of fear, not power. By staying calm, he was not only protecting himself, but also exposing the weakness in the officer's behavior. It was as if he held up a mirror, and in that mirror, the officer could see what he truly was: a man hiding behind a badge, mistaking intimidation for authority. The man's dignity didn't just protect his peace, it dismantled the illusion of power that the officer thought he had. The louder the officer became, the smaller he appeared in comparison. For those watching, the moment became unforgettable. Parents held their children close, whispering about the importance of staying calm under pressure. Younger onlookers recorded the scene, realizing they were witnessing something far deeper than a simple act of injustice. They were seeing the embodiment of grace under fire. Dignity isn't something that can be taught through words, it's witnessed in moments like these, where someone chooses restraint over rage and peace over pride. The man's every gesture, every expression, reflected a strength that no amount of authority could overpower. Even as the situation escalated, the man's breathing stayed steady. His tone, when he finally spoke, was soft and measured. He didn't plead, didn't beg, didn't try to convince the officer of his innocence. Instead, he stated facts calmly, as though he already knew that the truth was on his side and that it would eventually surface. His self-control wasn't about appearing superior, it was about protecting his integrity. He understood that how he handled that moment would define the story far more than what the officer did. By choosing to remain composed, he was already shaping the outcome in his favor, because dignity always leaves a mark that arrogance can never erase. The most powerful thing about his composure was that it forced everyone present to reflect. The officer, though he tried to maintain authority, began to falter in his aggression. The crowd, once silent, began to murmur, some even questioning why the man was being treated that way when he wasn't resisting. The scene shifted from one man's arrest to a collective realization about injustice. The man's calmness exposed everything: the bias, the abuse, and the emptiness of the officer's authority. It became clear that his dignity was not passive, it was active resistance. It challenged the system without shouting, and it reclaimed power without violence. Public reaction and justice served began almost the moment the truth came to light. When the officer's aggressive behavior was captured on multiple phones, the entire crowd became witnesses to something much larger than a simple misunderstanding. People who had once stood by in silence now spoke out, their voices filled with disbelief and anger. The man's calmness contrasted sharply with the officer's behavior, and that contrast made the truth impossible to ignore. The tension that had filled the air turned into outrage. Within minutes, the story started spreading online, a short clip of the officer shouting, another of the man being handcuffed, and finally, the moment when the officer realized who the man truly was. Each video clip became a mirror reflecting the deep flaws in the system and the consequences of unchecked authority. By the time the man was released, dozens of people had already shared the footage across social media platforms. It began trending almost instantly. The hashtags called for justice, tagging the police department, the city officials, and even national news outlets. The caption under most posts carried the same tone of disbelief: how could this happen to someone so respected, so composed, and so clearly innocent? The public outrage grew not only because of who the man was, but because the video captured something that many had experienced but few had evidence to prove: the everyday face of discrimination and power abuse. It wasn't just one man's humiliation, it was a story that represented thousands of silent experiences that never reached the spotlight. As the video spread, journalists picked it up, and soon, local media stations were reporting the incident. The headlines were direct and unflinching. They didn't describe it as a dispute or a misunderstanding, but as a clear case of racial profiling and misconduct. Interviews with witnesses painted an image of an officer who had acted out of bias, not duty. Calls flooded the police department, demanding answers. The officer's superiors couldn't ignore the mounting pressure. Within hours, an internal investigation was launched, and the officer was placed on administrative leave pending review. The system that once protected him now began to scrutinize his every action. The man himself remained composed throughout the media attention. When reporters approached him, he didn't speak with bitterness or anger. He spoke about accountability, respect, and the need for change. His words carried weight not because of his title, but because they came from a place of integrity. People listened. His message wasn't just about his own experience, it was about everyone who had been mistreated and silenced under the excuse of authority. His calm yet powerful response made him a symbol of resilience. He didn't seek revenge, he sought reform. That alone drew even more respect and admiration from the public. His dignity turned an act of humiliation into a movement for justice. Protests began forming outside the police department, not violent or chaotic, but peaceful and purposeful. People held signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Accountability has no rank." The video had awakened something collective, a shared demand for fairness that transcended race and class. For many, this incident was the breaking point. It wasn't about politics, it was about humanity. The officer's behavior had exposed the cracks in a system that allowed prejudice to wear a badge. And now, the public was refusing to let it fade quietly. The city officials, sensing the growing unrest, called for a press conference. They assured citizens that the investigation would be transparent and fair, but the people wanted more than promises, they wanted proof that justice was more than a word. As the investigation unfolded, more details surfaced. It turned out that the officer had received multiple complaints in the past for similar behavior, but none had been properly addressed. This revelation ignited even more outrage. People questioned how such a pattern could have been ignored for so long. It wasn't just about one man's misconduct, it was about the culture that allowed it. The man who had been arrested released a statement emphasizing this point. He said that while accountability for one officer was necessary, true justice would mean addressing the deeper issues, the training, the culture, the unchecked bias that allowed this kind of behavior to persist. His words resonated deeply, especially because they came from someone who had lived the experience yet still spoke of change, not hatred. When the department finally released its findings, the conclusion was clear. The officer had acted with prejudice and violated multiple codes of conduct. Disciplinary action was swift and public. For once, there was no attempt to bury the truth behind bureaucratic language. The chief of police issued an apology, not just to the man but to the community. It was an acknowledgement that something had gone terribly wrong, and that acknowledgement was the first step toward rebuilding trust. The officer's career came to an abrupt halt, but the story didn't end there, it continued to ripple through conversations across the country. People discussed bias, justice, and the role of power in law enforcement with a new urgency. The incident became a lesson taught in police ethics programs, a reminder that authority without integrity is nothing more than control dressed as duty. The man's grace through the ordeal inspired others to speak out. Community leaders began collaborating with local authorities to develop better accountability systems, and several officers publicly supported the reforms. What began as an act of injustice evolved into a catalyst for change. The man never celebrated the officer's downfall, because that was never his goal. His quiet strength had done something far greater, it reminded people that justice doesn't always arrive through anger or vengeance. Sometimes, it arrives through truth, exposure, and the undeniable force of moral courage witnessed by the world. A powerful message on equality and respect emerged from the aftermath of everything that had happened. What began as a painful encounter between prejudice and power evolved into a story that resonated far beyond the city where it occurred. People didn't just see an incident of injustice, they saw a reflection of what society still struggles with, the failure to treat others with equal respect regardless of who they are or what they look like. The man's composure, the public's outrage, and the eventual accountability together formed a message that could not be ignored. Equality, once again, had to be redefined not as an idea written in laws or speeches, but as a responsibility carried in daily actions. Respect could no longer be something demanded by authority, it had to be earned through fairness, humility, and understanding. The man who had been wrongfully arrested never sought fame or attention. When people invited him to speak about what happened, he accepted not to relive the humiliation but to turn it into something meaningful. In interviews and public discussions, he spoke softly but clearly about how equality isn't about giving someone power, it's about recognizing that everyone already has it by virtue of being human. His message was simple but profound: if respect depends on a person's status, wealth, or influence, then it isn't respect at all. It's conditional tolerance. True respect exists when it's given even to those who have nothing to offer in return. That idea struck people deeply because it exposed how far society still had to go in living up to the ideals it often preaches. His story began inspiring conversations in schools, workplaces, and communities. Teachers used it to talk about empathy, fairness, and moral courage. Parents discussed it with their children, using it as an example of why it's important to stand up for what's right without resorting to hate. Activists and leaders referenced it in their speeches, reminding people that progress isn't achieved only through laws but through the consistent choice to treat others with decency. The image of a man standing tall, calm, and composed while facing humiliation became a symbol of strength through grace. It reminded people that respect isn't a reaction, it's a principle that remains steady even when tested by injustice. The officer's downfall also carried lessons that went beyond punishment. It revealed how dangerous unchecked prejudice can be, not only for the people it targets but also for those who carry it. His arrogance had blinded him to the truth that equality benefits everyone. When people are treated fairly, trust grows, communities strengthen, and justice thrives. The officer had mistaken authority for superiority, and that misunderstanding cost him everything. Equality demands humility, it requires those in power to see themselves not above others but among them. The badge he wore should have symbolized service, not dominance. His story became a cautionary reminder that authority without empathy is empty, and respect built on fear collapses the moment truth appears. When the man spoke publicly, he never once called for vengeance. He spoke instead about growth. He said that equality isn't about revenge or reversal, it's about understanding. It's about creating a world where no one has to prove their worth just to be treated fairly. His words carried the weight of lived experience, and they struck a chord with people who had faced similar struggles in silence. For many, his voice gave language to feelings they had buried for years, the exhaustion of being judged, the frustration of being misunderstood, and the longing to be seen as simply human. His story showed that change doesn't always start with anger, sometimes it begins with dignity that refuses to bend under pressure. The city itself began to change after the incident. Training programs were introduced for officers to address racial bias and emotional intelligence. Workshops were held on empathy, communication, and community trust. For the first time, officers were being taught not just how to enforce the law, but how to connect with people as equals. The man's influence wasn't about power or politics, it was about compassion. He showed that respect isn't granted by rank or role, but by how one treats others when no one is watching. His grace had dismantled arrogance, and his silence had spoken louder than anger ever could. That quiet transformation began rippling through departments, communities, and even neighboring cities that adopted similar reforms. As time passed, the story continued to inspire change. The viral footage that once exposed injustice now served as a teaching tool, a reminder of what happens when respect is abandoned. Students studied it in ethics classes, law enforcement discussed it during sensitivity training, and communities referred to it when talking about equality and human rights. The man's experience had evolved from a single act of prejudice into a movement of reflection and growth. People realized that equality isn't about making everyone the same, it's about recognizing that every person deserves the same measure of dignity. Respect, once seen as a courtesy, was now being recognized as a necessity, the foundation on which peace and justice are built. The most lasting impact of it all was how it reshaped the idea of power itself. The man's story proved that true power doesn't come from control, fear, or status. It comes from character. It comes from the ability to stand tall when others try to break you and to remain kind when others show cruelty. Equality and respect thrive where humility and humanity meet. The story left a mark on everyone who heard it, reminding them that every act of injustice is an opportunity to choose compassion over pride, fairness over ego, and unity over division.